Chapter 6. Mummy's Boy. As soon as I got into remand home, I was stripped down to nothing, literally and metaphorically. I was put in the same clothes as everyone else, which was horrible for me. I'd always wanted to be an individual, and now I was no different to all the other idiots who'd landed themselves in there. My mum came to see me, and she was, unsurprisingly, distraught. Her son's life was disintegrating before her eyes, and it seemed clear that I was going to be sent down. My brother had been implicated, but I got pushed forward as the sacrificial lamb because my dad didn't want both his boys in the shit. My brother was older. I didn't have to persuade him to do anything. And looking back, I realised how severe it was that I had to take all the blame. There was a lot of dodgy stuff going on in that remand home. The closest thing I can compare it to is joining up with the Marines, which doesn't reflect very well on the military in this country. Not long after arriving, the remand home daddy headbutted me, and every day after that I was told I was going to be DB'd, which meant I was going to be the recipient of a dawn battering. For some reason, that never happened, but one night I woke up to see a load of kids standing over a bed, masturbating and flicking semen over this sleeping boy's face. Years later, the police interviewed me about my time there because there had been a lot of sexual abuse allegations against staff. I was only there for a short time, so for them to come to me suggests it was rife. 2 weeks after being locked up, I was taken off for trial. Seeing my mates again was awesome, like a brotherhood reuniting. There were 4 of us sitting in the dock along this leather Chesterfield-style bench with buttons on. My mum was in court in floods of tears. She thought I wasn't coming home for a long time. The judge came in, told us all to rise and said his piece. And when we all sat down again, a load of buttons pinged off the bench. I didn't really give a shit about what was happening because I thought I was going down and that was the end of it. So when I saw these buttons go flying, I dissolved into fits of laughter. All 4 of us were in bits, heads in hands, shoulders rolling, tears streaming down our cheeks, letting out little snorts and squeaks. We managed to get a grip before they read our charge sheets, and my charge was way beyond anyone else's. As it was being relayed to the court, my mum fell into the throes of a second wave of grief. I was rather more accepting of the whole situation, you might even say laid back, but astonishingly, they decided not to send me down. Instead, I got 2 years conditional discharge, 2 years supervision, and lots of other stuff I didn't understand. Afterwards, our lawyer said to us, "I have no idea how you didn't get sent down. I think the judge showed leniency because you were all crying when he first came in." Crying? We were laughing our tits off. Thank God for that bench and those faulty buttons. Apart from the supposed crying, psychiatric reports were produced in court, which showed that my father had left, my grandparents had recently died, and I was suffering from lack of attention. Whatever the reason for the leniency, I dodged another bullet. That whole episode with the shotgun was a wake-up call. Thank God for the Mitchell sister and her loose lips. I needed and subconsciously wanted someone to put a hand on my shoulder and stop me going down the wrong path. I didn't even recognise that I was playing with fire, but there was a voice deep inside of me screaming, "Please, someone stop me." Until that happened, I was going to push and push and push myself down the wrong path. But from that moment on, my long-suffering mum, whose whole world had fallen apart, who was broke emotionally and financially, led me from the darkness and into the light. My mum was an angel, almost faultless. I was very much a mother's boy. I idolised her from an early age, and she showered me with love and affection. And when I needed direction most, she was the person who put a hand on my shoulder to guide me where I needed to go. When you're a kid, you don't understand or really care what your parents are feeling. I never knew there were problems going on between mum and dad. She always seemed quite unaffected by anything. And even after my dad left, my mum was going through terrible hardship, grieving for the loss of her parents. With 3 mouths to feed, no help from my dad, and a son who was spiralling out of control, she soldiered on without complaint. Mum wasn't the kind of woman who cared about keeping up appearances. My dad would have been extremely embarrassed about my brushes with the law, but my mum didn't give a shit what anyone outside the family thought. Nothing else mattered apart from me and my brother and sister, and all she wanted to do was wrap her arms around the family and pull them closer. She even saw the funny side eventually, just as she manages to see the funny side in almost anything. Although she never forgave my dad for leaving us in the lurch, it didn't take Mum too long to realise that my dad leaving was best for everyone, including her. She started scuba diving. She fell in with a young crowd and would throw these great parties at the house, with lots of drinking, singing and dancing. This was a woman who wanted to join the Navy, so she had this pent-up sense of adventure. It was still hard for her financially and practically with 3 kids to look after, but she had a new lease of life. It felt like the black clouds had scuttled off and suddenly there was a lot of fun to be had in the house. Mum went out with a few blokes her age and found them boring, or we drove them out. For a while she was seeing this very well-to-do guy with a double-barreled name, and he ended up leaving because we were just too wild. Eventually, Mum started seeing a bloke called Simon, who was 20 when she was in her late 30s and I was 15. She just picked us up from somewhere when she pulled over and said, "Look, I'm seeing someone else. And he's quite young." She was apprehensive about telling us, but we didn't bat an eyelid. We were just happy that Mum was happy, and this new guy had a foot in both camps. He could hang out with Mum and also hang out with us. It wasn't just a phase Mum was going through either, because she's ended up marrying Simon and they're still together and extremely happy. My brother and I had go-karts, which we'd bomb around in over the playing fields. The police came over one day, again, because someone had reported us for go-karting on recreation land. We were hiding at the top of the stairs and could hear Mum saying, "Those little buggers, I keep telling them not to do this. Boys, where are you?" She came marching down the corridor, pretending to look for us, and we were on the landing laughing our heads off. Eventually, she went back to the police and said, "Look, I don't know where they are, but I'll make sure they get a good telling off." That was good enough for the police. What Mum hadn't seemed to appreciate were the 2 muddy tyre tracks all the way up her back and the grass in her hair. At times, Mum was as mischievous as us. She encouraged me with everything I showed an interest in. I was a decent runner, so she ferried me to cross-country races at weekends and was always watching when I was competing on the track in the 1500 metres. My best mate, Mark Sheriff, was a brilliant runner and we raced together. But I got kicked out of the athletics club because I wouldn't train. I was one of those kids who rocked up for a race and smashed it. I just couldn't be bothered. Had too many other things going on and couldn't dedicate myself to one thing. But at least I had positive things going on in my life, activities that gave my existence a meaningful purpose and made me feel vibrant and worthwhile. Not that my path was entirely straight and narrow after the shotgun incident. Unexpectedly, I was chosen to be Yellow Team Sports Day captain by my classmates, which was actually quite a proud moment. But because of the trouble I'd been in, the teachers put the kibosh on it. That rejection was a massive blow to me. It made me hate school even more, and I resented everything about it after that. True, I was a pain in the arse at times and failed just about everything academic. But they turned their back on me after the shotgun incident, weren't prepared to encourage any growth or entertain the idea that I might be able to recover the situation and make good. As far as they were concerned, I was a lost cause and a terrible influence. I had this rivalry with another kid in the 1500 metres, and our race at Sports Day was supposed to be a life and death battle. I hadn't trained and this other kid was the favourite, but I wiped the floor with him, beat him by about 200 metres. After crossing the finish line, I walked straight off the track rather than sticking around for prize giving. I didn't look back, and all the while I was thinking, fuck you all. After the shotgun incident, I became a bit of a loner. The kids from my school decided I was a nutter and their parents were probably telling them to stay away from me. I picked mates from different schools and they included some of the hardest families in town. I started drinking, going out to pubs and clubs, back when you could get in pretty much anywhere at the age of 15. Not that drinking wasn't heard of in my family. In Burton, a lot of people worked in the brewery industry and used to get paid in beer. My mum worked in a managerial role at the brewery. My brother did an apprenticeship as an electrician and went to work at a brewery. My sister worked for a brewery and would come home with crates of Diamond White stacked up in her car boot. I started skiving off even more, so when my dad invited me over to Malta, where he was selling timeshares, I jumped at the chance. The plan was for me to revise for GCSEs while I was staying with my dad for a couple of weeks, but I never bothered finding out when my exams were. When my classmates were revising, I was sunbathing on a beach. I returned from Malta with my hair bleached white and this amazing tan. But I missed most of my exams. I was walking down the corridor at school when someone ran up to me and said, "Fucking hell, Ollie. Mr. Henry's after you. He's hunting you down." I just thought, fuck this. Walked out of the school and never went back. My dad disowned me for a second time, but I didn't give a shit. I didn't see any value in the education system, had no interest. I didn't have any bandwidth left to absorb any pointless knowledge. There was so much else going on in my head. I was joining the Marines, and that was that. Nothing else mattered. Kids who are constantly getting into trouble don't normally have their hearts set on joining the military. It doesn't really add up, because if they're rebelling against institutions and authority, the last place they want to be is in the army, being shouted at and told what to do every minute of the day. I know my mum was surprised because she knew only too well how wild I was. The first time I was put on report at school, I came home, handed my mum a piece of paper. She opened it up and looked aghast. On the piece of paper a teacher had written, "I received this report card in the form of a paper aeroplane." The teachers used to say I could attain so much if I wanted to, but I didn't. But even though I was out of control, I craved stability and responsibility. Being a kid wasn't enough for me. I wanted to be a man already. My mum said to me, "Matthew, how are you going to be a Marine if you can't take orders?" And I replied, "The Marines will be different because everyone else will be doing the same." I wanted to join when I was 16, but was advised to wait until I was 18. Otherwise, my criminal convictions would have appeared on my military record. While I was on probation, my mum would drive me to Derby every week, where we'd visit the Royal Navy Marines Careers Office. Apart from the lady who scoffed at the idea of me piloting a submersible insertion craft, they were great to me. They talked to me for ages, let me read magazines and watch the training videos. Although I do remember my mum asking an officer what they'd teach me as a trade, and the officer replying, "To kill." My mum tells me she wanted to cry. For 2 years, I was in limbo, doing manual labour jobs to tide me over. Having started talking to my dad again, I even worked for him selling timeshares. I was one of those annoying people on the seafront, bothering you when you just want to have a nice stroll and eat an ice cream. I lasted 2 days before jacking it in. I didn't stick at anything because I didn't have a passion for anything. Whether it was at school, digging holes or flogging timeshares, none of it made me feel like I was living. Chapter 7. The Widest Smile. I never heard anything about the situation with the farmer again. It was all just dusted under the carpet. Clearly, the DS had decided that this story was a load of bollocks. Otherwise, they would have taken further action. But the fact of the matter was, I jumped in a car with a pisshead and compromised myself. You're allowed 2 goes at selection, so I had the option of giving it one more crack. But that wasn't my immediate thought when I got back to 4-5 Commando. It wasn't that I was embarrassed having to return. Most Royal Marines are very conscious of their limitations, as most people are. They are crack soldiers just by virtue of being Royal Marines. But most don't think they've got it in them to even apply for Special Forces selection. So there was huge admiration and support for how far I'd got. But I started to doubt my military career all over again. Selection takes almost everything out of you, strips you back to your bare minimum physically and mentally before asking the question, now what have you got? You end up reaching deep inside yourself, trying to dredge up every last grain of resolve. It's about seeing if you've got the necessary minerals to find something in those lowest moments. For example, if you're captured behind enemy lines or retreating and being hunted down like rats. I'd gone from almost leaving to almost getting into the Special Forces to being sent back to a place I'd been desperate to escape from. A place I thought I'd never see again. It was almost like being recaptured. and the idea of having to do it all again didn't seem that appealing. But I soon came to my senses. The fact I'd come so close once gave me the energy to do it all over again. On top of that, I could still remember the words of my sergeant. This is going to be hilarious. And I still had this flickering passion to be a special forces operator. Soon those flickers were fanned into a raging fire again. Second time around, SAS and SBS selections had amalgamated, so that there were 250 of us at pre-selection in Hereford, and it was only at the very end that people would be separated. In fact, I'm one of only a couple of people who have done SAS and SBS selection in its previous form. Amalgamation meant I'd have to tackle the dreaded hills phase. So this was going to be new ground. We'd be out on those hills day after day, running, marching, covering large distances in a limited amount of time, all while carrying a Bergen and a rifle. And it wasn't just aimless yomping. We're having to navigate, reach checkpoints, and all without any direction or encouragement from the DS. And if I suffered a bad injury or failed a march, that was it. But the early signs were good. We lost so many people on that first march over the Penny Fan, the highest peak on the Brecon Beacons. After day one, as many as 20% of the recruits were on their way home. But I smashed it. We had to cover 26 kilometres in under 4 hours, and I was one of the first 5 or 6 home. What I found odd about the hills phase was that we had an agenda, so we knew everything we were going to be doing. When it was purely SBS, we didn't know our arses from our elbows and survived on next to no sleep for the duration, and that was the hardest part. So the first 2 weeks was nothing compared to what I'd already been through. After day one, I was lying on my bed thinking, it can't be as simple as this. I was waiting for someone to burst into the room and throw a flash crash distraction device at me. But mercifully, it never happened. But after 3 days in, I was coming towards the end of a march, and among the first of 5 or 6 again when disaster struck. I was carrying quite a heavy load. It was raining and wet underfoot. As I made my way down this track towards the finish, pushing harder than was probably sensible, a slate slid under my foot. My ankle went over 90 degrees and I could feel and hear the tendon snapping. It wasn't pain that I was in, it was a state of shock. I've just fucked myself again, and this time, I'm not going to get another chance. I hobbled to the end and went straight to the medic, who helped me take my boot off. My ankle already resembled a balloon. The medic looked at a DS and slid a finger across his throat, meaning that he thought I was finished. Meanwhile, I was thinking, why is he doing that? Fuck! They think I'm dead. Back in camp that evening, the training officer, who had failed me the first time, called me in and said, "Right, we've seen the state of your ankle. I've spoken to the medics and we're going to give you a medical withdrawal, which means you can come back and try again. If you try to carry on and fail a march, you're gone and can never come back." The training officer thought my response was a foregone conclusion, but I replied, "With all due respect, sir, I'm not prepared to go home." As far as I was concerned, this was it. I didn't have the will to return to 4-5 Commando. If I accepted the medical withdrawal, I'd never go back. The training officer shook his head in disbelief and said, "Man up! Take the medical withdrawal and come back when you're fit." No. Well, as far as I'm concerned, you failed and it's your own fucking fault. I turned around and hopped out of the office. In selection, people are looking for the first excuse to bail out. You'll see people dropping out with twisted knees and ankles, blisters and bad backs. They're looking for something physical to blame because the alternative is to say, "I couldn't handle it mentally, so I had to throw in the towel." I didn't want to be one of those people, even though my injury was worse than anyone's I'd seen that had withdrawn before that point. The following morning, I got up early, strapped at my ankle with reams and reams of medical tape, and swallowed a shitload of ibuprofen. At the start of that day's march, the DS were looking at me with disappointed faces, probably thinking, what an idiot and what a fucking waste. The march was across the Elan Valley, which is some of the most frustrating ankle-bending terrain in Special Forces selection. The Elan Valley is a green, marshy desert with leg-snapping peat bogs and football-sized tufts of grass known as babies' heads. More people have failed or voluntarily withdrawn on the Elan Valley marches than any other. And, just as I suspected, it was fucking horrendous. Throughout the march, I had tears streaming down my cheeks from the pain. I just scraped through, but I had another week to go. But that's what I kept doing every day, guzzling painkillers, deleting some of the pain, listening to the Nina Cherry song, 7 Seconds, over and over in my head. It must have been on the radio a lot at that time. And doing just enough not to get red carded. That was down to pure desire. I just wasn't prepared to go home. I'd visualised how things would pan out, and I used that as my focus. Although towards the end, I had to shelve that vision because it would have become too overwhelming. When things get really tough, you have to boil it down to get one foot in front of the other. It might sound horrible, but seeing people fall by the wayside massively boosts your own confidence. I sometimes laugh about it with Jason Fox, my old colleague and mate from SAS who Des wins. We refer to it as the quickening, that phenomenon from the film Highlander, when a character chops an enemy's head off and steals all their energy. Up in the hills, I'd see older, more experienced, stronger-looking people dropping to their knees, crying and puking their guts up. And as I went past, I'd almost be able to see inside them. They'd be completely hollowed out, empty with nothing left. Sometimes I'd say, "Mate, come on, let's do this together." As soon as it was clear that they were going no further, I knew their remaining energy was on offer. They'd grimace and nod, and I'd get an injection of power, like a lightning bolt of electricity, before disappearing into the distance. Selection was the one place I'd been where image didn't mean anything. Humans are always self-doubting, always looking for things to go wrong. But selection made me realise how debilitating that thought process is. Our idea of where our limits are is often misjudged, because we're constantly comparing ourselves unfavourably to others. But it didn't matter how big or strong or fit someone looked before the start of selection. It was all just perception. That's why you don't just pick the fittest people and be done with it. Because you can put the fittest person in the world behind enemy lines and they might crumble under the mental pressure. Selection doesn't care if you can run a marathon in under 2.5 hours, or you compete in Ironman triathlons every other weekend. Far more important is that you can endure a high degree of mental discomfort for extended periods of time. The DS just couldn't get their heads around how I was managing to continue. The tutting and head shaking was replaced by raised eyebrows and wry smiles. And then after the first week, the pain started to plateau. I'd seen off the worst, or at least learned to accept it. I don't blame the DS for doubting me. In fact, he was a good egg to have offered me the medical withdrawal. The DS clearly thought I had it in me to be a Special Forces soldier and didn't want to see me throw away the opportunity. But people doubting you can be such powerful motivation, especially once you realise that a lot of people who doubt you are doubting themselves. Seeing other people push themselves to the limit and achieve outlandish things is horrible for some people. They know, often deep inside, that if they really, really tried, they could do what you're doing. But there's something stopping them from taking the first step. Once you've done that, the other foot naturally follows. A huge number of recruits didn't make it through the hills phase, but I did, and I earned a lot of respect from the DS for doing so. Not that they were popping champagne and showering me with kisses. It was more a case of, fuck off home, I'll see you next week. My ankle still wasn't what it should have been, but it had come a long way. And of course, I had been in the jungle before. One of my DS was a guy who was captured during the famous Bravo 20 exfiltration in the First Gulf War. Later immortalised by Annie McNabb in his book of the same name. This guy was a legend to all the lads, so I was desperate to impress him. Whenever our patrol got lost, he'd say, "Ollie, tell us where we are." And I'd usually be able to, because I had a wealth of experience after completing this phase before. But a week or so in, a DS decided to give me a bit of a buzz. He came up behind me and said, "How long do you think you'll end up doing?" "What do you mean?" "Well, how long do you think you'll last in the jungle?" "I'll do it all, I hope." After that brief exchange, the DS walked off. I thought, fuck, what was that all about? I thought I'd been doing brilliantly, but now I wasn't so sure. From when you're a kid, you're always looking for validation. When you're at school, you draw a picture, take it home, so your mum can ruffle your hair and say, "Oh, what a wonderful drawing. I'm going to stick it on the fridge so everyone can see it." Whatever you do, you want someone to put their arm around you and tell you how well you did it. You expect praise from teachers, university lecturers, colleagues and bosses. When a footballer scores a goal, he expects cuddles from his teammates and a thumbs up from the boss, not to mention the cheers of thousands of supporters. When a guitarist finishes a solo, he expects a smile and a wink from his bandmate, the crowd go wild, and a groupie or two secured in his trailer post-concert. But selection gives you none of that. And until you've had that validation taken away, you don't realise the dependency it creates. In Special Forces training, you might be smashing every march, nailing all the skills and feeling like a first-class Special Forces soldier in the making. But if nobody's telling you that, the worm of doubt wriggles its way into your mind and starts eating away at you. The lack of validation can rot you from the inside. People fail themselves in the jungle. Before they know it, self-doubt has consumed them. Their concentration goes awry. They start making mistakes, doing weapon skills, stop attending to personal admin. And here's the kicker. While it feels like nobody is paying a blind bit of notice to what you're doing, you're actually being watched at all times, because the DS send out local trackers to trail the patrols. These guys who are able to smell body odour, shit, urine and toothpaste from 100 metres away study everything you do, and any substandard soldiering is reported back to the DS. When the DS discuss a recruit, everything boils down to one question. Would you want that soldier to be working by your side in a few months' time? Discovering you're being observed and judged without you noticing can be very unnerving. But at least it flushes out some of the DS watchers, those recruits who look like supermen whenever the assessors are around, but start to shirk whenever they're not. I saw a lot of those guys during the Hills phase. They tended not to last very long in the jungle, with its all-seeing eyes. Selection is about conquering your own mind. To do that, you have to learn to self-validate, which might simply mean telling yourself you've had a good day when you've got a bit of time on your hands. Because in a real combat situation, you're not going to have someone patting you on the back and saying, "Well done, great shooting. Would you like a hug?" One morning in the jungle, I was told to make my way to the helicopter landing site. When I got there, the training officer was standing in the middle. My immediate thought was, fuck, is this the end? Have I failed again? The officer said, "Do you know why you're here?" "No." "Do you think you've done all right so far?" "Yeah, I think I've done everything I've been asked to do." "Well done. We've seen enough." That was that. I don't think they were doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. I think they probably thought that because I'd been there before, I was being more helpful to my patrol than they were comfortable with. The helicopter came down, I jumped onto the outer skids, and suddenly I was flying over the vast sea of broccoli. My whoops and hollers drowned out by the sound of the rotors. I spent the next 2 weeks sunbathing on the beach, catching stingray and supping beer. But not everyone had such a beautiful homecoming. Some were taken into a room and told that they'd failed. A lot of lads get binned at that point, which must be like making it through a 12-round title fight and losing on points. The bad news leaves a lot of very tough lads in floods of tears. But I wasn't too worried. I had the widest smile of all. Chapter 8. Special at last. Before I got to Hereford for my second round of skills training, I split up with Helen for a short while. So I was single, had nothing to worry about, and was absolutely loving it. One Saturday, I decided to round the lads up for a night on the razzle. The plan was to get haircuts, buy some new clobber, have a bit of lunch, hit the town, sink some beers, and hopefully still be able to talk to some women. Hair done, we headed to the shops. Most of the lads disappeared into Topman or Next, but I was more into Armani and Gucci. So me and two lads called Zach and Chaz made our way to a boutique that sold all the top gear. I was flicking through the shirts when all of a sudden I heard this scuffle. When I turned around, I saw the shop owner bent over and pulling up Chaz's trouser leg, revealing a pair of jeans underneath. Ring any bells? Yep, this is exactly what I got nicked for when I was an out-of-control teenager. Back then, I thought I was a genius for thinking of it, as if I'd invented fire, until the police told me it was one of the oldest tricks in a book, and what an idiot I'd been. My mate managed to kick the shop owner off and legged it, before the shop owner closed the door, locked it, and said to me, "You're not going anywhere." I'd been minding my own business, so I wasn't having any of it. But when I tried to walk past her, she started wrestling with me. Before I knew it, we'd toppled over, taken out a mannequin and fallen into the window. Imagine if you'd been shopping in Hereford that day, and the town was mobbed with weekend shoppers. I managed to push her off and get through the door, before screaming down the street to the local car park. Heading back to Stirling Lines Garrison, I couldn't believe what had just happened. There was a helicopter buzzing overhead, and I was thinking, fucking hell, they've scrambled a chopper in search for me. All sorts of crazy possibilities were going through my head, and the fact I'd done nothing wrong did nothing to allay my fears. Because rolling on the floor with a female shop owner and a mannequin is not a good look. I managed to get myself back to the garrison without being captured, and when I walked into the dorm, Zach and Chaz were sitting there smirking. Suffice to say, I didn't find the situation as amusing as they did. "You fucking idiots. What the fuck have you just done?" We'll be all right. Who's going to find out?" As they were saying that, an MOD police car came down the drive. "Whatever happens, I was not involved with this. You better tell the police the truth." It transpired that Zach had told Chaz about this genius shoplifting trick, and Chaz, thinking it was a brand new wheeze, had gone and done what he was told. The fucking morons had been planning it the whole time, as if it was the great train robbery and they were Ronnie Biggs and Buster Edwards. We were taken down to the police cells and it all erupted. I told the police that it was fuck all to do with me and suggested that they talk to the shop owner. Even that suggestion carried an element of risk, because even though it was true that I didn't try to nick anything, I did end up wrestling with her and one of her mannequins in the shop window. Meanwhile, Chaz had confessed, but Zach had denied knowing anything about it. The rest of the weekend was hideous. Having been falsely accused of beating someone up, I now thought I was going to be binned because my mate had tried to nick a pair of jeans. As funny as it sounds, at the time, I genuinely thought they were going to chuck me out in disgrace for a second time, never to return. On the Monday morning, the DS who had thrown me off the first time popped up again to rip me a new arsehole. And the whole time he was bollocking me, I just felt so embarrassed. I know exactly how pathetic the situation was, because I'd done it myself as a dumb 14-year-old kid. I pleaded with the DS to speak to the civilian police, but he wasn't interested. As far as my bosses were concerned, an unsavoury incident had taken place, and even if I had nothing to do with it, I was with the miscreants when it happened. As it turned out, Zach got away with it, but Chaz got dumped and sent back to the Marines. That was such a shame, because he was such a great bloke. I felt so sorry for him, and I still speak to him today. For the rest of his life, he'll have to tell people that he very nearly became a member of the Special Forces, but got thrown out at the last minute for trying to lift a pair of jeans. As for me, I remained on the course by the skin of my teeth. Soldiers have a self-destructive streak. There is no doubt about it. Chaz had gone through months of hell, had one foot in the door of the most illustrious fighting force in the world, and he risked it all for a short-term thrill. No rational person would do that. A lot of soldiers tell me they want to tear their lives down and start again. Soldiers have this ordered world created for us, and all we want to do is pull the pin, blow it apart, and deal with the chaos. It sounds like madness, but it's that borderline madness that gets soldiers into the special forces. And it also makes perfect sense because soldiers sit happily amid chaos. It's as natural as a bird sitting in a tree. After the not-so-great boutique robbery, there were all kinds of jokes going around. What's the difference between the SBS and the SES? It's all in the genes. I was just embarrassed that I'd been part of it. Second time being hunted down in the hills was pretty much the same as before, except I was a little bit wiser. Before we were released, I got some £20 notes, screwed them up as tightly as possible, put them inside some condoms and swallowed them, knowing that 2 or 3 days' time I'd shit them out. And having advised the rest of the patrol to do the same, we'd be loaded. I've heard stories about people swallowing all sorts, even watches. Even after my experience the first time, I still believed in accessing barns and houses wherever we could. One day, we took shelter in this derelict house and shit out some money, like some weird human ATMs. We had 40 quid between us, so the next step was to find a shop where we could spend it. I discovered some workers' clothes, put them on, and hitchhiked to the local village, where I found a mini-mart. I filled a basket with Mars bars, crisps, cans of Coke, and was dropping the basket on the counter when I heard someone say, "The boys have turned up." I looked to my right and saw a troop carrier from the Hunter Force pulling up outside. Oh my fucking God. These boys had pictures of us, so I was shitting myself. They started filing into the shop and I was standing there with my 100 Mars bars trying not to talk because I didn't want anyone to know I was English. When the girl behind the counter asked how my day had been, I mumbled something incomprehensible under my breath. I settled up, put my head down and waved some soldiers in as I left. When I walked past the troop carrier, they were all looking out the back, looking hard as fuck and no doubt thinking, "Look at that soft civilian prick." When I got back to the house, I was handing out the grub and telling the other lads about my close shave when someone shouted, "Fuck! There's a patrol coming down the street." Most of the lads hid, but I was still in my overalls, and by this time, a couple of builders had turned up. So I said to them, "What can I do to help?" When the soldiers arrived, looking menacing with their guns, I was shoveling cement into a mixer. I pushed it further and shouted in my best Welsh accent, "All right, boys." The soldiers smiled, waved back, and off they trotted. Second time around, I made it through the escape exercises without being accused of punching a farmer. The end came after 10 days on the run when we reached an RV and people suddenly came at us from all angles. That's when we knew the harshing had begun. We were bundled into a cattle truck, driven off to an unspecified destination, and when we were bundled off again, there was a lot of jostling and screaming and shouting, as well as dogs roaming around us, growling and foaming at the mouth. As I stood there, 2 guys worked their way around me, prodding and poking and talking right in my ear. It was as if they were performing a weird comedy act, or they were grotesque clowns from a horror film. One of them kept pushing me and saying, look at him," in this creepy high-pitched voice. It was very unsettling. Which, of course, it was meant to be. The clowns were the warm-up for the 36 hours of interrogation, which began with being hooded and led out to a shale-covered area. Then they turned the stereo on. Unfortunately, the speakers weren't playing my favourite tunes. They were pumping out this horrendous white noise. Imagine the sound you hear when you phone a fax machine by mistake, mingled with hundreds of nails being scraped down a blackboard, except 100 times louder, and you'll get the idea. While they were attempting to make our ears bleed and our brains melt, they were putting us into various stress positions. Every time I lost my shape, someone would stick their knee between my shoulders or pull my elbows back. There always seemed to be a person hovering over me. This lasted for a good few hours before they took us away for questioning. Having given me a boiler suit to wear, they pushed me into a room and stripped me naked. I still had my hood on, but could feel someone moving around me. Without warning, the hood was removed to reveal 3 women sitting behind a desk. Suddenly, one of them started pointing at my cock and shouting, "What the fuck is that?" For what seemed like hours, they were taking the piss out of me, telling me how pathetic I was and laughing. Between the abuse and demoralization, they kept asking me for my name, rank, and number. The point being, I wasn't allowed to give it to them. There is one thing I should say before we move on. It was very cold in that room. Suddenly, I was strapped naked to a pallet, and they were hosing me down with freezing water. And the whole time that was happening, I wished I was back in interrogation. I just couldn't wait for it to end. But when they started interrogating you again, you wish you were being hosed down with freezing water. In another room, there was this big bloke sitting behind a desk with a bag of sweets on it. Over and over again, he'd ask me for my name, rank, and number, between popping sweets into his mouth. In another room, there's a really nice guy whose whole purpose was to put you at ease and catch you off guard. You've got to avoid saying yes or no in interrogation. And the nice guy was the interrogator most likely to make you forget yourself. When you first go in for interrogation, you know you've got 36 hours of it. But you have to forget all about the goal and measure the time in seconds. You can almost feel your brain frying, so that sometimes you don't know what you're doing or saying. You just have to hope that while you're on autopilot, you're not doing or saying anything wrong. It's full-on psychological warfare, the weirdest thing I've ever experienced. The games they play are vicious and cruel. It reminded me of that scene in the film, A Clockwork Orange, when they clamp the main character's eyes open, experiment on him and torture him with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And it certainly gave me an insight into how horrendous it must be for people who are taken hostage for real. Most people make it through interrogation, but some people fall down on the home straight. One of them was Zach, who was suddenly singing like a canary. He was telling his interrogators about security at our base, that he could get access to the CCTV systems, and just about everything else he shouldn't have been. Afterwards, a rumour went round that he was given a truth serum. I've got no idea if that was true, but the story went that they wanted him off because of the incident with the jeans. And why on earth would he be telling them that stuff otherwise? It just didn't make any sense. Either way, I didn't give a fuck, given that he'd messed up everything for my mate, Chaz. When the 36 hours were up, I was taken into a room, my hood was removed, and there was an officer standing in front of me. Without any fanfare, he said, "I am the umpire. You've passed. Congratulations." There was no cinematic moment where I was whooping and hollering and high-fiving the umpire, but it did feel like a boulder had just rolled off my shoulders. Out of 250 soldiers who began selection, I was one of only 7 who made it to the end. I was 24 years old and a member of the illustrious Special Boat Service. My old maths teacher might have been surprised if he ever found out. I wasn't. Chapter 9. Rather beautiful. Even to this day, my mum says to me, "I phone your brother, he tells me what's going on in his life. I nod and say, 'Oh, that's very nice.' I phone your sister, and it's much the same. Then I phone you, you tell me what's going on, and when I put down the phone, I think to myself, that boy's life." The thought of my mum telling her friends what I'm up to makes me giggle, because I know they'll be raising their eyebrows and scratching their heads. Whether it's fighting off apes in a circus, firing stolen shotguns over people's heads, jumping off harbour walls at the age of 3, or abseiling down buildings, my life had always been a bit different, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I see young lads setting off on their career path, which would involve sitting in an office for 5 days a week for the next 40-odd years, and think, is that really what you're going to do for the rest of your lives? They start earning decent money, get a mortgage, and before they know it, they're stuck in a rut. Through my business, I meet older guys from the corporate world, and they say to me, "I can't fucking believe I'm still doing the same job. I just feel so lost. But because it provides me and my family with a certain lifestyle, I can't escape it." I don't know how people exist like that, because it means they're destined never to achieve anything that will give their lives meaning. The majority prefer to take the well-trodden path rather than the path less travelled, because taking the path less travelled means having to hack your way through. That's a difficult thing to do, or at least it seems difficult, when you're standing staring at the overgrowth and you don't even have a machete. Some people need to know exactly what their future will be and become lost in society's perception of what happiness is supposed to look like. Owning nice houses and expensive cars and watches is a way of justifying their existence. But how many times does cooking in your 50 grand kitchen, climbing into your 100 grand Porsche or looking at your 10 grand Rolex watch actually make you happy? For the first week, maybe. After that, not much. Everyone is beset by fear and negativity. It's fear and negativity that kept us alive since the dawn of time. All of us are living in the repeat cycle of yesterday. Our minds tailored to a survival pattern. That means doing the same today as we did yesterday and every day before that, because that's what has kept us alive until now. It doesn't matter if we've been sad or unfulfilled. For as long as we can remember, all we focus on is the fact that we're still here. That's why people find it so difficult to break out of the cycle. And even if someone does manage to break out, their brain starts saying, no, it's too scary. This is too difficult. You need to get back into your comfort zone. But the notion of comfort zones is contradictory. Living life in a comfort zone might feel comfortable, but it's just existing. It's like living your life in a trench. There might be water up to your knees and rats running around your ankles, and you might be miserable as hell. But as soon as you pluck up the courage to stick your head over the top, bullets start firing and you think, fuck this, I'm getting back in. The mind is devious. Whether it's thinking about going to the gym or quitting the job you hate, it will come up with all those different reasons why you're better off where you are, back in that horrible trench. I hate social conformity with a passion. I see so many people conforming. People who don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. If you ask them why, they won't have a clue. That's such a waste. I was expected to conform, but I never did. I went the opposite way. So even when I went into the special forces, I knew what I was doing wasn't the norm. I was doing stuff that people would envy, but that's a lot of people would hate to do. Some people just aren't that way inclined, and I shouldn't be smug, because after the numbness and elation associated with becoming a special forces soldier had worn off, I wasn't entirely satisfied either. On completing selection, I was so proud to make that phone call to Mum. And she was over the moon that her son was in the SBS. I got to wear the fabled blue tracksuit in camp, which gave me a lot of kudos. I felt cool as anything walking into the mess hall in that tracksuit. Girls would nudge each other and whisper behind their hands, look, SBS. I also got to walk past the office of my old sergeant, the guy who told me how overjoyed he would be when I failed. I gave him a big smile, a little wave, and a thumbs up. And he completely ignored me. But the reality was a bit more complicated. I had to bust a gut to get into the Special Forces, and it was a case of, really? Is this it? Weirdly, I like being pushed to the absolute limit. So having only recently passed selection, I was already missing it. There was always pressure to perform on selection. I missed the competition, testing myself against others. Maybe that's not surprising considering how much time I spent doing it. After summer leave, I joined up with my troop and did lots of different courses to bring me up to speed with the rest of the team. We were sent on a combat dive course straight away because the SBS have a commitment to protect all British maritime assets as their primary role, which requires waterborne insertion techniques. Some people do that dive course and realise it's not for them. They can't clear their ears or they encounter other issues and switch to the SAS. You only dive into 3 meters, it's just a means of transit, but so much can still go wrong in the pitch black of the night. Usually after you've gone to target and removed your breathing set. It's dangerous work in the Special Forces and accidents happen. But that's what you sign up for. There was one exercise which I wasn't on that involved the lads chucking their MIBs, military inflatable boats, out of the helicopter, parachuting after them, inflating the MIBs, jumping in, firing up the engines, chasing down the destroyer and inserting. They were about to get on the destroyer when the skipper realised he was getting too close to the shore and whacked it into reverse. The MIBs got pulled under and the lads got sucked into the destroyer's propellers. Luckily, they missed the props, but one guy was almost snapped in half on the rudder and broke both his femurs. Another time, a guy was sitting on top of a submersible insertion craft, doing what he had to do, and there was a massive swell, which crushed his head between the insertion craft and a helicopter above. Just before I joined, a good mate of mine died doing some freefall jumping out in the States. He had a parachute malfunction, and the drill when this happens is to cut away your main to release the reserve. But his main got caught on the buckle of his dummy weapon, which should have been removed, and went straight into his reserve. He fell 25,000 feet and ended up a pile of mush in the middle of the desert. He was a great guy who never let go of his friends from his previous career in the Marines, which some people in the service disliked him for. Later, I found his grave where he died and painted his faded name back into the stone. All the time I was training, a lot of which took place on oil rigs practicing counter-terrorism and the release of hostages, we were on call with 30 minutes notice to move. About 7 or 8 months after I joined the team, I was mooching around pool one weekend when my pager went off. My first thought was, this must be a drill. Then I saw the code and knew it was real. It is difficult to describe the excitement I felt, but just imagine it. 1 minute you're doing a bit of shopping, the next you're being asked to pull on the black gear and go into action. I guess there is something of a superhero about it. I rushed back to camp where all my kit was already stowed and ready to go, and straight into an in-brief. We were told there was a ship coming into British waters loaded with drugs, and that intelligence had reason to believe they were armed and dangerous. Luckily, so were we, which is why they called us. It was our job to intercept the ship, take down anyone on board, and hand the ship over to the authorities. But not one bit of me was scared, because this is what I joined for, and I was ready for anything. Our whole troop was put on a frigate out at sea, where we had to wait. That was desperately frustrating for all of us. There were 16 highly trained soldiers raring to get on that ship and do our thing. The testosterone was pumping. The anxiety was building. And the whole time we knew that the job could be called off at any moment. Not that we were sitting around playing cards. For weeks we ran mock-ups, planned and briefed until we could visualize exactly what might happen when, or if, the time came to execute. And because no plan survives first contact, a lot of what we did was contingency planning, or planning for any plans we made that might not go to plan. Eventually, and to my relief, the call came for us to go. Seconds later, I was sitting on the boat, making its way to target under the cover of night, dressed head to toe in black, including the balaclava, and holding my assault weapon with laser dot sight. And it was everything I thought it would be when I was a kid. The kind of thing my careers officer would have laughed at had I suggested it. But just as I was thinking, this is fucking amazing, the engine on my boat started spluttering. Suddenly I was thinking, fuck, no, please don't do this to me. My world was falling apart. The other boat was fine and heading off into the distance, and we knew that if our engine didn't spring back to life, they'd have to go on without us. All that planning, all those rehearsals, possibly for nothing. And then the engine kicked in again. In the Special Forces, we always have two plans. One is when the shit hits the fan and you have to go in hard and hope everything goes well. The other is the plan of your choosing, when you have more time to dictate the outcome. Usual protocol is to hit the target at dawn, so that by the time we've taken the target, we have the benefit of daylight to hand over and extract. This was the case with my first job. The transit was quite a long one, but eventually I could make out the target in the gloom. It was a big, long sailing boat with masts, which had been anchored out to sea for a few weeks. There'd been a massive exchange, the contraband was on board, and we hoped that the enemy, or X-rays as we call them in the Special Forces, were tucked up in bed and fast asleep. When I heard, "Stand by, 2 minutes," I knew it was almost on. Which is when the negative feelings and thoughts start flooding in. What if we board the boat and there were gunmen waiting for us? What if I get shot? I had to wrestle with that fear, pin it down and incapacitate it in order to focus on the mission, which was such a leap from anything I'd done in the Green Army. Mine was the first boat to the target, and I was the first man in. That's not to say I was the best or the bravest. I was pushed forward simply because I was the new boy, the least experienced and therefore the most expendable. The team leader is the guy with the most experience, the one who has the most to offer the group, but he's never going to be at the front of the pack. Command and control does not usually come from the front, because when it comes to the crunch and people could get shot, you have to protect your best asset. The engines on MIBs aren't particularly noisy, so we were able to get straight into the hold of the ship without being detected. We headed for the sleeping quarters, kicked open the door, threw in a flash crash grenade, which is just meant to disorientate rather than maim or kill, and started clearing our objective. All the X-rays had been asleep, and when my target opened his eyes, he was looking at a man dressed all in black, wearing a balaclava and pointing a machine gun at his face. What a thing to wake up to. As strange as it might sound, I felt sorry for him. He had been out on this ship for so long, done this huge deal, and would have been imagining a better future. Now he had a laser dot between his eyes. I could see the fear, panic and loss, and his world falling apart. I was only 24 years old, and this guy had scars all over his face and looked nasty as hell. I stood there thinking, if this was down the pub, he'd probably give me a good run for my money. But the fact he wasn't in a position to do so gave me such a massive feeling of power. They were hardened criminals, had all probably done time, but we could smell the piss and the shit immediately. I don't blame them, because they had no idea who we were. We could have been members of a rival drug cartel about to kill the lot of them. Luckily, we'd hit them by stealth and there were no rounds fired. If someone had been having a fag on deck and spotted us coming, we'd have had to do things differently. They might have put their hands up, but they might have grabbed their weapons and started firing. You can have all the plans in the world and they might not make an ounce of difference. In the special forces, as in any branch of the military, you cannot choose your enemy. You just have to deal with whatever is thrown at you. To some degree, you're being dictated to, but you can't let that happen for long. At some point, you have to take control. When pressure starts being applied, you have to strip away everything else and focus on one thing, which is the threat. It's not really a case of being calm. It's about learning to deal with that level of pressure, which comes down to all the training that we do. If you're properly prepared, you'll be able to keep on top of your cortisol levels and see things in slow motion. It's like momentarily entering a parallel world, so that when it's over, you can never reimagine it. Afterwards, you think, what happened? That didn't seem real. You go somewhere else, like in the Matrix. Ship seized, we got them down on the floor, snapped the plastic cuffs on and called support elements for extraction. A frigate came close, HMRC operators came on board. We disappeared into the ether before heading straight to a hot debrief. The main concern was that no one from our side had been injured or killed, but it doesn't matter if the job went well or not. The debrief is essential. I speak to people in the corporate world for whom debriefs are an alien concept. They're too busy discussing how awesome they are down the pub or running to their car because they don't want to get a bollocking. But debriefs are where lessons are learned, and the information gleaned from them is fed into future operations. Even the best operations contain some shit moments. The engine on my boat almost gave out, for Christ's sake. And when you're trained to the level we are in the SBS, you become extremely self-critical. What could we have done differently? Maybe I should have done this instead of that. Could I have stepped left instead of right? You see that same forensic self-analysis in elite sports, such as when a football team wins 5-1 and a manager will complain about the one goal they let in. It's about looking for imperfections in the apparently flawless. That first mission was every bit as good as I thought it would be, apart from the spluttery engine. And it was what I wanted to be doing every day. To see all that training put into action was an amazing feeling. The communication between the team was almost telepathic. You knew everyone else had your back without anything having to be said. As I was thinking what should be happening, it was happening. There was such a flow to our movements, and we fitted with each other perfectly. It was as if we were performing a ballet, with everyone exactly where he was meant to be at any given moment. It was seamless, harmonious, and really rather beautiful. What made our operations even more miraculous was that our little dance was often only a part of a far bigger picture. As we were inserting onto that ship on my first mission, there were other ships being hit and doors being knocked all over the UK, Europe, and further afield. That level of coordinated planning is almost unbelievable. Our team, with all the Gucci gear, was like the star on top of a Christmas tree. But without all the infrastructure and everyone working in tandem, whether it was people pushing pens or working in the stores, we wouldn't have been able to do our job. It only takes one person lower down to make a mistake for the whole operation to come crashing down.